Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and here I am in front of the Melville monument in Edinburgh. So this was erected in 1823 to immortalise the memory of the first Viscount Melville. So that's his noble title, but he was actually born Henry Dundas. So there you can see him atop that obelisk, and he's looking to the west. I'm not sure there's any significance in the direction that he's looking. So we're on St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh. So no other person in Scotland has a memorial quite like this. No monarch. So it really is staggering that he should be memorialised like this. So who was he? And it's particularly contentious these days that he should have such a vainglorious memorial in the middle of Scotland's capital. He was known as the great tyrant to many radicals. His views these days would be almost universally regarded as rebarbative. Well, he's born in 1742 here in Edinburgh. He's born over that away on the Royal Mile, the most historic street in North Britain. And his father was president of the Court of Session, as in he was a high-ranking judge. So he grew up in a sort of wealthy and erudite family, and he went to school at Dalkeith, later the Royal School here in Edinburgh, and then he went up to Edinburgh University. There were only 4 universities in Scotland at the time, but it was a lot, considering Scotland had a population of not much over 1 million. And so many people here are very proud of the fact that they had 4 universities when England only had 2 and Wales had none. And in Ireland we only had 1 in those days. Anyway, so he read law, and he was soon called to the bar, or the faculty of advocates. An advocate, that's a barrister in Scotland. In most of the rest of the world, you'd simply say lawyer. So he practiced law, and his career flourished. He was a Tory in politics. The Act of Union had been passed not long before. The Jacobites had been defeated. He was a very firm adherent to the Hanoverian dynasty, and a strong believer in the Act of Union, which by the late 18th century was not seriously questioned. And he was, I think it's fair to say, reactionary in politics. So some of the main issues at the time were what the Honourable East India Company was doing in South Asia. Now, I know most people would take issue with that description of it honourable, but that was actually part of its name, even though I'd realised most people curse it today. So he very much believed that the United Kingdom ought to expand its dominion in the subcontinent. And by the time he was middle-aged, one of the most tendentious issues in public affairs was the abolition of slavery, and he was utterly opposed to ending slavery. Obviously, he was very evil in this regard, and we would now recognise that, but a lot of people agreed with him at the time, particularly those who had a vested interest in holding people in servitude. What else about his opinions? Well, he held various cabinet positions. He was Lord Advocate in Scotland, which is really sort of head of the legal system. And eventually he was Home Secretary for the whole of the United Kingdom. He was, I can't remember what it was, sort of a Lord Treasurer, various things like that. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. That's a civilian in charge of the Navy, who was never a sailor himself, he was never a naval officer. It was a position that Winston Churchill later held. And then the war against France broke out in 1793. France declared war on the UK. Okay, so the French Revolution in 1789. So it was a time of political turmoil, and some radicali here were very admiring of what had been taking place in France and wanted to replicate that here in the United Kingdom. So he was dead against the French Revolution, and he believed in fighting France to the finish. Now, there were radicals who tended to think that France was a more moral country than the UK, and France thought we ought to be emulated. In fact, the French abolished slavery. I know Napoleon brought it back, and then it lasted to 1848. But for a while, the moral balance was definitely in France's favour, but he didn't see it that way. So he was in favour of severely curtailing civil liberty, in restricting freedom of expression, in suspending habeas corpus, and the various attempts to overthrow the government. Most people lived in the most abject penury at the time, and he evinced not the slightest sympathy for them, their attempts to better their lot, and didn't believe that most people ought to have the right to vote, believed in flinging people into prison for expressing contentious opinions. He thought his opinions, however contentious they were, that was entirely acceptable. People being transported to Australia. He'd been completely against American independence and things like that. So he seemed to espouse just about every reactionary position going. Didn't want to extend the franchise even to most of the bourgeoisie. He was adamantly opposed to Catholic emancipation. He was brought up in the Church of Scotland, so he's a Protestant, believed in discriminating against the Catholic minority, and on and on. So these days, as I say, most people would think that his views were really vile. But nevertheless, he achieved preferment, and he was certainly successful in his political career, even if his views were deeply immoral. And there was a radical war in Scotland around this time, which is a bit of a misnomer. There was the United Scotsmen, a bit like the United Irishmen, who wanted to a revolution. They wanted a republic. They also wanted separation. Now, their anti-monarchical opinion had some traction. The idea of breaking up the Active Union had very little support in those days. Perhaps surprising, because you think how things have changed, how communications are so fast. I mean, obviously telecommunications, but transport and so on, and people travel around. Wouldn't Scotland feel more bound into the UK than ever? But apparently not. In the 18th century, it wasn't like that. Of course, we don't know what the man on the street thought, because there were no opinion polls back then. Many people were illiterate, so we don't really know what the working class believed, because they left very few written records behind. Is the lives of the wealthy are much better recorded, because they could write and they expressed their views in newspapers, books, public orations and so forth. So anyway, and he helped to really squash the radicals, and some of them gave some gallant and truculent speeches before suffering a fate worse than death. Transportation to Australia, usually sent to Botany Bay, that's now Sydney, or indeed to Van Diemen's Land, we now call it Tasmania, and so on. That was Henry Dundas. So he's raised to the peerage, ennobled as the first Viscount Melville, and obviously passed on down the generations. So there's this, isn't there a Stuart Melville College in Edinburgh? But I don't think it's to do with his family, actually. Anyway, so he died in 1811, and then this monument was erected to his memory in 1823, and sailors of the Royal Navy, they donated the money to put this up. In 1806, he'd been accused of embezzling a staggering sum of money from the public exchequer, so he was impeached. Process Trump is going through nowadays. I mean, I don't know when the last impeachment was before the British Parliament. There were ones before that, famously Warren Hastings, who'd been Viceroy of India, but he was eventually acquitted. I don't think we don't do impeachment anymore. There was talk of doing it to Blair, and people wondering whether it'd fallen into abeyance. Doing it to Tony Blair was when he was Prime Minister over Iraq. Now, he had his eye on the top spot on being First Lord of the Treasury. Didn't happen. So he'd been an ally of William Pitt the Younger, who was Prime Minister for quite some time, although he disagreed with Pitt on Catholic emancipation. Remember, Pitt the Younger, he wanted that for West Britain when we became West Britain. That should go along with the Active Union, and had that happened, things might have turned out differently. Irish nationalism perhaps wouldn't have got going, even if it had become popular, probably not as popular as it eventually did. So that's him. And the person who organised putting this up, just doing the construction side of it, that engineer was Robert Louis Stevenson's grandfather, that celebrated Edinburgh writer. So his father and grandfather have been amongst the best engineers in the UK. All right, so that is enough about Henry Dundas, someone whose name would be damned by most people these days. So please follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and indeed on Instagram. Book online lessons with me, or lessons in person if you're in London. You can direct message me here, and subscribe, and donate on PayPal, please, on Patreon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.